that's one thing that I found really interesting when I was looking at the React types is like, how do I actually get a conversation started? Where does that conversation happen?
Yeah.
And how does that work?
Is there any future of keeping the TypeScript types for React with React, even, without rewriting React, but just keeping the definitions there in the repo?
Yeah, I think the way React is released right now, it would be like a bit of a problem because of how rare React releases are. What is typed in the lib.dom.ts is the HTML body element interface. This document.body, this implements the HTML body element. But that's not the same as attributes on the HTML body element. There's like an important distinction there. The HTML attribute is called class, but the property on the interface is called class name. And as far as I know, there's like no library for like HTML attributes out there.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. This is the first in a new series. We're going to call it Let's Code. And basically, the idea is it's a day in the life of open source development. So there's lots of really cool projects out there that need a lot of love or get a lot of love. And I want to showcase what it's like to maintain those projects and just talk about them and their goals. Sometimes when you're maintaining open source software, you have to make decisions that may not make sense at a PR level, but there's like a macro scale you have to think about. And the decisions you make can echo to eternity. And so you have to be kind of conscious of that. And I think it's useful to learn those skills and to see what people are thinking when they go through the PRs. So there's more to it, maybe, but we'll see as the series goes on. So let us know down in the comments if you have any feedback, what you'd like to, kind of the direction you'd like this to go. It's a pretty open forum. We don't have a big schedule, what we're going to do. We can look at issues on GitHub repos. We can go through PRs and do PR reviews. We can just talk about what the thing is and what we're trying to solve. It can be anything. And with that, I'd like you to, if you guys could, we'll start with you, Matt. Could you introduce yourself, please?
Sure. My name is Matt Pocock. I'm a TypeScript full-time educator, I guess. I've been a React user for like 5 years at this point as well. So I've been using React longer than I've been using TypeScript, weirdly. And I'm kind of excited to talk about the session today and see how the two mesh together.
Awesome. Sebastian.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Sebastian Silberman, which sounds like really awkward to pronounce in English. It's not nearly as cool as it sounds. I'm the main maintainer basically for the React types. I'm also a testing library maintainer, just like specifically the React testing library. And I'm also part of the React core team, where it's basically my job to do like the React types and the testing library integration. So yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you. Big heavy hitters we got here on the call today. I'm a big fan of the work that both of you guys do. I think you know that, but just got to say it. So Sebastian, tell us about the React types. Why do they exist? Why isn't React written in TypeScript? Can we start there? You don't have to answer that. You don't have to answer that.
No, there's going to be like the theme going through this is like all that like React has like a long history. Types have like a long history, and it's just the way this historically developed was like that Flow was like the big Facebook thing. So React was written with Flow, and it still remains to this day because like rewriting is like a big thing and it needs like a justification. So we had to always bolt on React types and for TypeScript. And the way we do this is like with like these types packages, which you have like all over your package.json. It's like always this prefix like add types. And then you have the library as a suffix. So for React, this is types React. These are all published on NPM from a single big repository, which is a pro and a con at the same time. The big pro is we get like all the integration. Like when we do like a single change to the React types, they get tested against every other types. So this is like really nice to like, we don't ship things that are untested, and we are pretty confident that they work as expected. And that is like the big thing. And So I just wanted to like kind of like go through where these types are located and what the contribution story is, because we need more people to work on them, or not just more people, but like fresh eyes on them. We had like this like past 2 weeks where like Matt was going into the types and like asking like important questions there. Why are things the way they are? Can we make things differently? And that is like super helpful because like me and Dimitri like are like doing this for like a long time now. So
yeah, I suppose I should mention, I didn't introduce myself, but everyone here knows me on the channel, I suppose, a little bit. But what you might not know is over the past few years, I have chipped in here and there with the React types. Some days, some years more than others. I think at my peak, I went a little too hard and got burned out because, well, of exactly the thing we're kind of showing here today is there's a lot of work that goes into doing this and maintaining this stuff. And, you know, I had one particular experience with the props. What was it? Props with children type, where somebody wanted to make it. Do you remember that one, Sebastian? It was a long conversation. It was one of those where there's like you have like, you know, like 10 paragraph responses. You each follow each other for 3 weeks. And I finally got the guy to just have a call. I just like, can we please just get on a call and talk about it? Because there was definitely like we were talking past each other. And we got on the call and we found out that it came down to a difference of interpretation of the word with. He's not a native English speaker. I think he was from Brazil. And there was just like, he was thinking about that word in a different way. Because like, anyway, it doesn't matter. But it's a cool example, I suppose, of like, the kind of thing that can happen and can go on when the whole world is looking at the code that you're writing. You know what I mean? So here we are. Definitely typed.
Yeah, definitely. You just look at like 22 million downloads. Like you're touching like a lot of code, and with like TypeScript specifically, like everybody has like a different interpretation about like how strict types should be, how loose types should be, and getting the balance right is virtually like impossible. Like if you just look at TypeScript itself in the TS config, like how many compiler options you have there, like that is like a lot. We can't do this at the types level, unfortunately. So we have to make like some decisions and like upset some people. Some people will be happy about these changes. But the way open source works is you usually only hear about the problems you cause, not the solutions you provide. So
yeah, totally.
But yeah, for like React types, all from the same repository. If you go on the npm page or the README from the file, you get like a link to where these are hosted and which people like work on these. So if we just go there, it's usually just like a single file. Like we try to keep it simple.
Could you zoom in a little bit or a lot, actually?
Yes. So there's like I'm trying to, what is like basic about this? You have like your usual package.json. You have like your index.dts where like every type is in there. Like there are a couple of other files that are a bit special to React that I don't really want to go into. And I don't think it's like worth it talking like through all the 3,000 lines.
No, it's okay.
You can go into specific details later. But for going like, what does it look like to make a pull request? There are some really nice things on the definitely type repository that help us like manage just the scope of the repository. So I mentioned earlier all the authors, like when you change a file, like how do you know that like your file is changed? And the way definitely type does it is when you are in this list above here, you basically get pinged every time there's a PR opened against the React types. So I'm in here, Dimitri is like...
I'm right 4 below you, or 3 below you, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And basically these people get pinged and they are responsible for reviewing that PR.
I'm guessing that's because Definitely Typed is just such an enormous GitHub repo. It might be one of the largest GitHub repos by lines of code in the world, possibly the biggest. Like just because it has so many different packages included in it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what the size. It's probably the most diverse repository, I would say, because like you get like all these different packages that are hosted in here, different people in there. So I think like maybe like from the amount of contributors, it's probably like the biggest. And
Definitely.
you
And
can
you do not
manage-
want to be having notifications on the entire repository, right? So they've come up
No.
with this custom system.
Exactly. So it's kind of like GitHub code owners, but in the single file, and like they build on top of it. And once you basically file your PR, what I usually do is I file them as a draft. So there's like an example PR I just worked on a bit earlier, some little cleanup. And once you add it as a draft, there's like nothing happening at all. And that is like the nice thing, because for React, CI is quite involved. Like it takes an hour to run or something like that, because we have to test against like 700 packages and stuff breaks. So you want to make sure it's clean. And once you have the ready for review, like a lot of magic is happening from the definitely typed side. Not going to wait for it because it usually takes a while, and maybe it doesn't. But what it basically does, once it's ready for review, it goes through the list of authors. It's going to post a comment here, pinging everybody. And then once you approve this, it's basically like an auto merge stuff. Once somebody approves, you can like instruct definitely type to merge it. Like you just post a comment, ready to merge, and then it merges the types and it auto publishes them. So there's like not much more involved for us. It's really just reviewing the stuff, approving or rejecting, and the rest is like all solved for us. Fortunately, here it is.
So one really important part of the contributor story. Sorry, there's like thunder happening outside, giving me a sort of ominous tenor to my words. Because there's obviously like when you get up to the repo and you launch a pull request and you've got all of the ways that you can get your PR merged. But then there's all the steps before that, right? There's the lead up to that. It's how do we have those discussions and how do we talk? Because that's one thing that I found really interesting when I was looking at the React types is like, how do I actually get a conversation started? Where does that conversation happen?
Yeah.
And how does that work? So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's like a good point, because it works again, like because of the scope, it works a bit differently. Like usually what you do, you open like issues on repositories. For definitely typed, we moved away from that. I think it kind of like tells you, there's like an issue. Like so going back, you want to open an issue, and then like there's an issue with the types library. And that is usually what you want. Like, hey, the React typings are not working. And then it just basically redirects you to the discussions on GitHub, which I find I like more, because they allow like threaded conversations. Like an issue on GitHub is just a single thread, and like discussions allow like threaded discussions that can be helpful. And then to open like a issue against a specific package, I think it doesn't tell you here, so that's a bit obscure, but usually I think you have to put it in brackets, like for React, and then your title. I hope I can delete discussions, so I'm just gonna add an example here. So this is, I think, really important to say like, hey, this is for the React package. And this is important because it needs to find the proper people to ping. So it goes back to this index.dts. There it is. Gets like all the authors and pings them so that I know, hey, there's like an issue I can attend to, and just created noise for everybody and I can't delete it. Oh, okay. Too bad. But this is kind of like how you get like the conversation going. There is like a definitely typed Discord, but it's usually not for discussions around like single types. It's usually like a support channel. For like discussions about like what should happen with the types, it's usually better to keep this in the open, because you want to link to it later, right? If you change a PR, you want to link to the context that existed before, and you don't want it to be hidden on Discord. I think Discord remembers every message, so that might not be a problem. But yeah, so this is how you get the discussions going, get the people involved, and then we get like notifications, and then you kind of like decide whether you want to step in or not. So this is for opening new issues. Finding existing issues is similar. So instead of issues, you go to discussions, and then you get like labels for that. So you can filter by label, and then and then you get like a list of. I think this is open discussions for React.
All of these things you're saying, do they exist in documentation anywhere as well?
That's a good question. I think like you find like that a lot of open source projects kind of like assume that you know issues and pull requests. That there's like a lot of like stuff that is kind of like required. I think I noticed this the other day. I think it was because you asked like where are like discussions happening. And I was like, look at the contributing on GitHub. And that doesn't exist here, but it's in the README. But yeah, you have to read a lot, which I understand. It's like
so. I mean, I'm kind of wondering. I know that there's not any timeline or any future right now where React is going to be rewritten in TypeScript, but a lot of packages that are, I mean, like Jest used to be written in Flow and Immutable.js and Yarn and other libraries, and what some of them would do is keep the type definitions in their package and publish it with their package. Even though it's not written in TypeScript, it would be kind of maintained in parallel, but in the repo. Is there any future of keeping the TypeScript types for React with React, even without rewriting React, but just keeping the definitions there in the repo?
Yeah, I think there's like the way React is released right now, it would be like a bit of a problem because of how rare React releases are compared to how often we want to maybe release like a change to the type definitions, because like maybe some HTML attribute was like added or we forgotten about, or like we improved the typings. Like I think that like over the last 1 or 2 years, we had a lot of PRs that improved like what string values were accepted so that you get like better autocomplete. So instead of a string, you get like a literal, and that is like really nice. And moving that into React gets like now we either cut a patch release before just with the types. And since that is a bit involved, the way React is released, it would add a lot of work there. And it's like an interesting discussion to have generally. Like I generally like the types approach because it kind of like decouples like runtime upgrades from like type upgrades. Like you can just upgrade to, like, let's say we had like React 17 and 18, and there were like some like all the concurrent features that were added, but most of the stuff you might not use. Like usually the way we recommend it is you just upgrade to React 18, you switch to Create Root, and everything just works. And if we can just do that without changing like the typings, because the typings we had to do like a lot of breaking changes there. Kind of like the decoupling was like nice to have.
To follow on from that, it's kind of fascinating that you get this difference because like Semver is really well defined for runtime stuff, when you have major breaking changes and you have minors and you have patches, but it's less well defined for types, right? Because if you suddenly stop exporting a function from a module, that's probably a major breaking change. Whereas if you stop exporting a type from a module, is that a minor? Is that a major? Because maybe we should be doing more major changes. And it's sort of funny that like the types for React sort of need to stay in step with the major of React itself, because it would feel very strange if you had like 18 on React and then like 26 on React types or something, you know. So there are sort of these funny constraints there. I'm really interested to get your thoughts.
Yeah, that is like the versioning strategy is like interesting, because I didn't mention that, like for like the types packages on definitely typed, it's always like the major and the minor are always matching, but the patch version is just completely decoupled. Yeah, because like you have like maybe like 80 patches for the types, but just 0 for React itself. So that is kind of like the decoupling. And then for the Semver part, the Semver part is like interesting. I think a year ago there were like some efforts to define Semver for types, which was interesting and largely matches like my interpretation, like how I do it. If you stop exporting like a utility type, that is what I would consider a breaking change. But if you you constrain a type even further, like instead of a string, you just accept like 2 literals, that I wouldn't kind of like consider like a breaking change, because it's kind of what you want from the types. Like you do want them to catch mistakes. So it's always a bit difficult. Like every time the TypeScript team like largely says like, yeah, every change is a breaking change. We can't map this to Semver, and give up basically. But that's what you have to do. There was
Actually,
we did
That raises a good question. I think all three of us know, but for the benefit of people watching who might not know, how are the TypeScript React types versioned? What is the relationship between a React version and the version of the types?
Yeah, so like the major and minor are always matching. People who don't know like majors and minors, it's like the first 2 are always matching, and then the patch is like a lot higher. So like it can even like lag behind, because we now are on React 18.2, I think. The types kind of like say they are still on 18.0, but the reality is in 0.1 and 0.2 of React, there weren't like any new features, so we didn't just bump it. What you largely want to look at is the major version, and the patch is like completely decoupled.
So if 0.3 has some feature that requires more types, would you bump the type from 18.0 to 18.3?
Yeah, then we would bump it. It's kind of just like we were lazy, and you don't just want to release like make a change and then like the types are now on 18.2, but it didn't. Like we should probably do it just to avoid the confusion, because you may be like wondering like, okay, if I have like 18.2 installed but only 18.0 types, is there like a problem I might run into? So we should probably just do it out of force of habit. And then
if you're stuck on a previous old version, you need to know exactly which. It's going to be very hard to work out which minor version of the types you should be on, right? That's tough.
Yeah, exactly. It's complicated, definitely, but it's just I think like a good compromise. And
I have a question. Oh, sorry, you carry on.
I think I just wanted to go into like why we don't like move the type more into why we don't move the types into the React repository. Again, I'm in the React core team now. Like I know what's going on, and I don't think we would really benefit from it. Like instead of working on the definitely typed repo, I would work on the React repo, and that's basically it. Like we lose like a lot of infrastructure we have on definitely typed. Like Dimitri being pinged just for type stuff wouldn't work. He would have to watch the whole React repo, which is noisy for everybody else. Like, yeah, it's we lose a lot of the infra stuff, and like even the public flow types of React are sometimes out of date as well. The way we React is like structured, like all the internal stuff doesn't really flow. So not deflow, but like don't really flow into the public interface. So I think there was like some experimental hook or something like that was outdated on TypeScript and on Flow. So that's that. And then you wanted to ask a question, Matt.
Yeah, the thing I was thinking about was because TypeScript, like, I usually think of like a library when I'm building a library, when I'm maintaining a library, as especially when it's a TypeScript library, when it's written in TypeScript, is I have the runtime and the TypeScript and they're shipped together. And I can basically I could ship a feature in my library that is TypeScript only, that has a minor version bump that basically that has a change log that says, okay, something in the types changed and this necessitated a new version of the library. With React, you can't really do that, right? Because every change has to be led from the runtime. It has to be led from the actual code base itself. So you can't release a new minor version that's just a type bump. So I'm wondering how you do that and how you would even coordinate a change in the TypeScript types that would be a breaking change. For instance, like the useRef stuff. How would that even happen?
Yeah, it's basically we have to wait for the next React major. That's what we did for like the implicit children change we did. That was like 2 years in the making or something like that. We originally wanted to do it for 17. And then we talked, either I pinged Dan or I asked Dan, and he was like, yeah, we kind of want to have like as little breaking changes as possible. So we were just like, okay, let's not do it and wait for 18. And then we did it for 18. And then since I knew when like 18 was about to hit, it was just basically on the day clicking the merge button, and then it was immediately released. But yeah, this is kind of like, there are like 3 or 4 things we would like to do in the React types that really help, but that I basically just decided are like too big of a breaking change. So we wait for 18, and it's like people are kind of like disappointed because they want them now, and they know that like React major releases take
That's the common thread with all of this. People are disappointed.
Yeah, and I'm kind of like, that's kind of like why I want like more people in there and like new people in there.
No, I don't say that to put you down. I think it's like inherent to the job, like there's you're going to disappoint some people doing this, like, but I think the reasoning you just gave is very sound. Like, to try to break as few things as possible is not without cost. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's a hard discussion. You have like into like, you can give like a general rule of thumb usually, apart from the, okay, like if you remove like a utility type, that's a breaking change. And the reason is usually like, if you remove the type, like what do you gain from it? Like you can just keep it in there, you mark it as deprecated, you don't support it, and that's it. It can just stay there. For other stuff, it's a bit more complicated. Like for the one change we have like scheduled for 19 is like for like use reducer. We want to, the contextual typing, improve that a bit, but it involves like changing the generic parameters for use reducer. And I tested it a bit on like my the code base I'm working on at work. And there were like 10 or 15 occurrences where this kind of like broke. So I just made like the decision to like, okay, let's not do this. Even though that is like a really nice change that is in there, like you get like some way better autocomplete, and I'm super happy when this lands, because I think it also removes like an overload or something like that. And yeah, it's just removing stuff, making stuff better. It's like the best thing you always aim for. But yeah, it's hard because you also don't want to do like, you don't want to accumulate too many breaking changes, because then people are kind of like put off from like upgrading maybe to React 19, which has nice features, and the way TypeScript is now like ubiquitous. Like if it doesn't work in TypeScript, many people don't consider it like working at all. So it's kind of like, okay, we don't want to put people off from upgrading to React just because the types broke. But yeah, like anecdotal, like at work, we did this as well. And we just added a patch that removed all the types breaking changes from it. And then you were just done with it for now. And then until a few days ago, now we're like on the latest typings and have it. But yeah, I would encourage people to like upgrade the runtime and deal with the types later. But it's like hard to teach and not go overboard, that you don't end up with like any's and TS expect errors and ignores everywhere.
So I find it interesting that, like, I imagine that people contributing to this then would have to. It's sort of a shame that even though you'd be contributing to this, you'd be waiting for 19 to drop, basically. And because if you want to make some changes that are breaking, or that, fix some stuff, or even introduce, I guess, new types, maybe are there types of changes that you could imagine being shipped before 19, and what would those changes look like?
Yeah, we had like a good example of something we added that was considered like by people a breaking change because of the nature of the change. Let me just, yeah, so there was like a certain set of attributes that were working on like standard elements like a div or a span or something like that. And the person making the change added these attributes to it. And that was kind of like, yeah, it's like, it sounds like a feature. You just add properties, right? So you just go over it, make it that it works everywhere, and you ship it. And it just turns out that, like, yeah, it does break certain cases. Because inherently, every time you add a property to an interface, it's basically a breaking change, because somebody could extend that interface with that property before it already existed. So now the properties are like mismatching. You get like a breaking change in the literal sense, like CI is now red, that is breaking. But it's just the kind of breaking change we have to take on to like say, yeah, it's like a little attribute, just ship it. And that's like a feature you can add. So
but this is like just typing the DOM, right? This is just a DOM feature that wasn't covered by the types before, I guess. So the types after the change are more truthful,
exactly,
and more accurate. So actually, doesn't that make the errors that are then uncovered good errors, like errors that don't represent a breaking change, but that represent a positive change?
Yeah, that is usually like my argument that I give there. Like, types are now more accurate. It's like unfortunate, and then also the consideration like, what do you have to change to unbreak it basically in your code base? And in that case, it's adding like a little omit wrapper around it and just remove it from like your interface, and then that's kind of like it's like a very minor thing you have to do.
I can think back to some issues where it's happened. I can't think of one specifically, but it's happened a bunch of times that someone will put in a change just like the one we just saw to say, hey, because the React types, people maybe not think about this, but the React types contain lots of information about the DOM. And sometimes the DOM changes. And sometimes it changes in different browsers, but not in the others. Or sometimes they change in different ways because there's things that aren't standardized yet. And so we get all of those varieties, all of those combinations I just mentioned, we'll get PRs for those things. And sometimes there's a bit of a back and forth. It's usually very amicable and fine, but sometimes there's a bit of a back and forth I see with people where, they'll say, well, but this is in Chrome and I only care about Chrome. And it's like, right.
Yeah.
But,
there are like two different like types of these. Like people want to add attributes that are not like in the living standard and that are experimental only in certain browsers. And for that, it's kind of like easy to say no to that, because adding props to your own types is pretty straightforward. And we have it documented in the React TypeScript cheat sheet. And it comes up often enough that we have this now like narrowed down to like, okay, here's like a link, like a 5-sentence explainer why and how to unfix it, and then you're done. And the other type of issue is sometimes people want to add props that are not supported by React, because React doesn't just forward this stuff to the DOM. The casing is sometimes different. Like if you have like a event listener or something like that, that the casing is very important there. And if you don't have the casing right in React, it's going to scream at you and make warnings. And we try to kind of like map that. And what is like a good example? Like I think the inert HTML attribute, which is now stable across all browsers, but not implemented the way you want to use it in React. If you pass inert true, which is kind of like the way you would expect it to work in HTML, you don't get the result you want in the browser. You have to pass a string to it. So it's very complicated, not the way I would want it, but the kind of decision where we have to say like, okay, we don't add it to the types, because if you would use it the way you want in the types, you don't even get the right runtime behavior. So we have to like, okay, we have the DOM and we have React, and the types are kind of like in between and like communicating what is like working in React the way you would expect.
Because TypeScript itself has its own way of handling the DOM, right? So it makes its own decisions about what should be included in a global type that's sort of kind of actually not even versioned by TypeScript, but it's called lib.dom.d.ts.
Yeah.
And by default, in most projects, that's going to be included. And it sort of, I remember it being explained to me by Auto, but I can't remember quite what it was, but something like it takes in something that's supported in at least 2 or 3 browsers, or some sort of rule like that. And it's a shame, I guess, that React can't inherit from those types, because that would just solve all your problems in terms of having attributes removed and added, because React does this sort of interesting layer in the middle.
Yeah, I think that's also a bit different, because what lib.dom.ts is, it's not telling you what HTML attributes are available. It's telling you what is available on the DOM interface properties. And these are like different things. Like if you...
Yeah, I think the famous one that I know about, and hopefully I'm not wrong about this, the DOM interface is called class name, but in HTML it's class, the attribute for CSS.
So what is typed in? Okay, let's take it body. What is typed in the lib.dom.ts is the HTML body element interface, and that is what you would get if you add like the DOM imperatively, right? Like this document.body, this implements the HTML body element, but that's not the same. That's not the same as attributes on the HTML body element. There's like an important distinction there. And the mapping, even in the DOM, is not like one-to-one, like what you said with like class. Like when you write button.class, like the HTML attribute is called class, but the property on the interface is called class name. And that is kind of like where like React doesn't have like a consistent handling, I think. I think we usually go by the properties, not by the attributes. But sometimes we also make stuff up. Like I think like default checked is kind of like the attribute checked, but not the property checked, because that is like reflected during runtime. So it's not as straightforward. Like we couldn't just take the interfaces and inherit from them, because it would break like in a couple of cases. And as far as I know, there's like no like library for like HTML attributes out there that we could use.
React.
And yeah, basically. Yeah.
So I see you have some tabs open here. Is there a particular issue you wanted to show or look at for today?
No, I think the coming back. So this was kind of like a breaking change we added, right? We added to a new attribute to the HTML attributes, which every element inherits from. And when you kind of like had like a custom interface that extended from that, and you had like your custom content prop in here, that is no longer compatible with the new property we moved up there. And that is kind of like, yeah, that was the breaking change. And the fix for that is pretty straightforward. Like, okay, you still extend it, but you exclude the content property, and that's it. And this is the kind of breaking change that is happening, and that kind of causes friction. Understandably, like people getting annoyed by types breaking, and then the maintainer just saying no. Like that isn't like a nice experience. I've been there myself, so that was kind of like the one thing I wanted to go through.
This person mentions it would be great to do an announcement. What is the mechanism by which people can be made aware, other than seeing a bug or seeing a red squiggly in their code when they update?
Yeah, I think the one thing that is missing from like every types package is like a change log. Like we don't have that. The only thing you have is, like every change is a new version. But I don't even think like I wouldn't know how you go from a version to like a PR. I don't think there's like a good way to do that today. So that is definitely something that's missing. And that, if somebody wants to build this out for like definitely typed, I think I opened like somewhere an issue where it would be nice if the publisher could like add like a change log from the commits, because I usually like write like pretty long PR descriptions and try to like explain it why.
Well, comment down below, people who are watching, if you're interested. The changelogs are actually an area that I'm super interested in and have spent some time developing in the past, but I don't know if I want to get into it here. But it is an interesting problem to solve, because there's a lot of concerns to take into consideration and a lot of different ways to do it. They all have their downsides, I think. But it's definitely... It's definitely a nice thing, though. I can spin what you said in a nice way. Something that's happened to me personally. There's a couple times I've gotten a PR merged in the React types, and I've seen other people comment on this. If you get a PR merged for the React types, you'll be able to use that in your code base in production pretty quickly, because it's releasing very frequently. So just like Sebastian just said, that is the nice side of all of this, is that you don't have to sit and wait around. Like we were just talking with React. React is very conservative about releasing in the last few years. It's a good thing that React is that way, but it would be painful if we had to wait for a React release. We'd be waiting months and months or years in some cases.
It does sound like, though, with certain things, with actually most changes to the types, right? It sounds like that is the timescale, right? A long-term release cycle.
Because like I think like most stuff, we don't need to do much at this point. Like it's mostly fixing historic mistakes, and these are like usually like, okay, these are breaking changes, and these take like a long cycle. But like the other stuff is like fairly quickly. I think there was like a problem with some experimental hook that wasn't typed correctly, and it was really just like a Twitter mention and like, hey, types are wrong, and then like.
I'd love to ask Sebastian, what because you mentioned there like some sort of legacy mistakes or some things that maybe you, or I guess the TypeScript React team maybe wishes they'd done differently. I'd love to know what you think some of those are, and what the plan would be to do about them.
I think the use ref came up like 2 weeks ago. It is, I don't want to call them like mistakes in that way, because it's kind of like, okay, if we go like 2 years back, you wouldn't have done it. Problem is just for a lot of these things, like the React types are like 8 or 9 years old by this point. Just things evolve over time, and for like ref specifically, without going like into too much details why it is about it, basically evolved from the original create ref typings, which is like for class components. And there were like different constraints. And then you go usually by okay, it looks similar, so I just copy it for like use ref, and then it works. And it has like a lot of foot guns in there. So this is like something we want to change, and that is basically ready, and just like now waiting for like a React 19 release.
Nice.
Because
what else might qualify in that category?
I think so. The big thing in React land are like server components, and the lack of support for them in the React types. Like if you want to return a promise, it's not going to work. And that is like a thing that we unfortunately can't fix in the types, because these things are hard-coded into the TypeScript compiler. And from what I checked, they are now working for 5.1. They are revisiting how they infer these types, and they want to go and ask the JSX factory, which used to be create element and is now in TypeScript. It's always like create element because we were cheap with it. But these types are like very old, and
for those watching and for me as well, could you explain kind of how React works in TypeScript, how it understands JSX, what that does?
Yes. So what TypeScript does, TypeScript asks the global, or we want to go to a scoped JSX namespace, and it asks the type definitions like two things. Like if you're like a class component, what does the element class look like? Is that assignable? And for the React types, that is basically like a React component, which returns a React node from render. So for class components, we are kind of like, okay, that works. For function components, what it does, it asks if the function returns either a JSX element, so that's that one, or if it returns null. And that's why TypeScript will not allow you to return a Boolean, a string, an array, a number, or like now a promise. And that's kind of like how this is hard-coded. And
so if we remove that line of code, then would only null work then?
I think even if that doesn't work, it falls back to any, which is maybe what we want to do if that doesn't work out in the TypeScript part, because but yeah, if it doesn't find that, it's going to fall back to any. And that also means that if you like write like any div in here, that will become like an any, because it's like a JSX element. If it doesn't find that, any. And the way I understood the TypeScript change is that instead of asking like for these elements and kind of like making a decision like what a function can return and what a class can return from render, it's going to ask, what does the JSX factory accept? So for those who don't know, when you write your JSX, like your div, like what actually will happen at runtime, that some Babel plugin or like another transformer will take that and will transform it to like a create element call for like the old runtime and just call it with a div. And what TypeScript should ideally be doing, and what they want to try to do, is instead of asking these elements, it's going to look up this function and will ask it like, hey, do you like accept this string, or do you accept a function returning a promise? And once that is kind of like done, that enables us to like, okay, these create element typings, like, do we want to revisit them because of performance concerns, maybe because they're doing a lot? If you want to look at create element, it's like 8 different overloads that are trying to do something. There's even like a to-do in here that is old. And for like, it's like 6 years old to do.
Classic.
And when React does that, we might want to go back to like, okay, maybe we can like simplify these types to make it performant, because it might get like really expensive to do this, because like in real world code bases, you have like 10 nested JSX elements, which means they're like 10 nested function calls, and that can become really expensive from what I heard about like the TypeScript.
So sorry, you're saying that in TypeScript 5.1, they're thinking about ditching this reliance on JSX.elements and instead linking through JSX Factory to create elements. Is that what you're saying?
That is how I understood it, yes.
Wow. So I see. So a lot more stress would then fall on the definition of this function, and it would have to be
Exactly.
a bit better. Whereas this currently is not really a public API. Not that many people are using it.
Yeah, it's not really intended for it because sometimes it's trying to like, okay, if you give me like an input type, I give you like a React element with like the props all typed out, but it's not doing that for all elements. And all the JSX host components here, like input and button and div, that is like really expensive because there are like 200 of these. So like checking all of them would become like really expensive. So we might want to ditch this for like something simpler that just says like, hey, does it look like any element type in here? And then that's fine. So like, does it look like a class component? Does it look like a function component or any of the other components?
Very cool.
And that kind of like enables us to like, okay, now we don't rely on TypeScript telling us what we can render with JSX, but we can like change like our JSX factory, and then that's it. So if we want to allow function components to return a promise, we can do this in the types. If we want to allow it to return a context or anything else, we can do that. So that's going to be really nice. And these are like...
Would this open the door to potentially children being able to take, let's say, generics from their parents, type arguments from their parents, and be like a typed child?
Yeah, this is something a lot of people want, like in JSX itself. But we would have to test this really well because that is, from what I understood, really expensive to do like at the type level. So it might be that we still say like, yeah, we can't do it. Or maybe we should like separate types and say like, if you use that and you're okay with the bad performance, then that's okay. Because what I said, like, I think that would be like cheap to do if it's just like a single function call. But if it's like a create element with like children, which also renders children, which also renders children, like I think TypeScript has to go like deep down, instantiate that type, and then go back up. I think that got like really expensive.
Oh, I see. Yeah. If you're talking about like, so you have like, imagine you have a top level parent that has a type argument that has a child that has a child that has a child that has a child that actually has the thing that you care about in terms of the type arguments.
Yeah, exactly.
That sounds like a problem for user land, right? Actually, like in terms of the libraries that are creating this, it doesn't seem too crazy.
Yeah, I'm not too sure about it. Like this was usually like when people wanted to do it, that was usually like the concern that might get expensive. And I think also why this looking up the JSX factor was kind of like put off. Like the initial, I don't know when it was, like 3 years ago, there was like an initial work be done on this. They tested it and they said like, yeah, the performance can get like really bad on like deep trees where you have like 10 diffs that are nested. And so they kind of like put it off. Also because back then the issue wasn't as pressing. It was like, okay, you couldn't return a string, but then you just wrap it in a fragment and be done with it. But with promises now and server component, it gets a bit more tricky. Like there, it's a bit more, okay, like now we really need to, or we really should revisit it and fix it.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I want to ask, so we got to wrap up a little bit soon. I want to ask, is there any big thing that you would like to see, or any changes that you wish could be added to the types, or some big regret, anything like that? Looking back now that we've had some time to reflect on all this. No is a good answer. If you want to say no, then
no, I don't. The problem is if I say I'm like pretty satisfied with the way the types are, people will say like, oh, but this thing isn't working in my code base, and you're like satisfied. It's like a bad,
okay.
Bad
All right. Well, as one of the people maintaining it, I'll say, of course, we maintain it because we use it, and I think there are definitely weird things now and then, but I'm able to be so productive with this stack, with TypeScript, with React, and make cool things. And usually when somebody puts up a PR, we respond to it. I see people responding to it if it's not me or anybody else pretty quickly. So that's a good segue into my last question I wanted to ask you, which is how can people get involved? And, what would be the best way to jump in on this and to help?
Best way to jump into it and help. I think that's what I said. I think there are like very few little issues you can do. That is like the unfortunate part because they are mostly done, and we are looking like now at problems that are really complicated. I wouldn't mind, or maybe do we have too many? Like if you really get involved, like look at the pull requests. Like I wanna get actually like Matt in here to like get pinged on PRs to get like his point of view in there. Because it is really nice to just for people to like read through it and ask like, why do we have this JSX element constructor? Like, what is this thing? Like, I think this is like, I don't want to say regret. It's just annoying that this thing had to exist because of implicit children and component types and all of this like stuff. But if you have an issue, you can reach out to me on Twitter or like open an issue on the definitely typed repo. That is usually the best way because I read every notification.
That's a good thing to mention. I just have to thank you. The whole world, no pressure, but the whole world uses the code that you write here in the React types. I've told lots of people over the years, they say, oh, wow, you chip in on that. That's great. And I'm like, yeah, but honestly, it's actually mostly just one person who's been doing it all these years. And that's you, Sebastian. So you've really changed a lot of lives and improved the state of the world quite a lot. So I think that's something that's sad about software engineering is I came to this field from a medical industry where I'm like actually dealing with people and changing lives. And it was a really nice thing. And then I did software engineering and I feel like some days I'm not doing anything good for the world. But this is a great way to do good for the world. If anybody out there listening wants to get involved, it's a really fun experience and pretty welcoming experience, I hope.
If you have any problems with these types, something is odd, something you don't understand, raise an issue, please. Like as Dimitri said, I'm doing this alone. I'm like tunnel visioning on a lot of stuff, and I need some fresh eyes, and I need fresh air. Okay.
Cool. Okay, we'll leave it at that. Thanks, guys.
Thanks. Bye.
Okay.
Bye.